This database lesson is about something called aggregate queries. It is using a new clause called the group by clause. The objective of this lesson today is to learn what an aggregate query is and when we will want to use it, to introduce us to the group by clause and a number of aggregate functions. So what exactly is query aggregation or query grouping? Well, as we've seen in some previous videos, we will often have in our databases a large amount of related data that contains duplicate values in it, but still that relate to, say, a single customer, or there's a data relation in there. Now, when we're working with these large amounts of data, we often want to organize it, but that will still not always give us exactly what we need if we used something simple like a sort. You can get part of the way sometimes to use the distinct keyword, because what the behavior there does is it eliminates any duplicates that have the records. Query aggregation is very similar to how the distinct keyword works, but it just gives us a lot more options. Another name for aggregate queries are summary queries, or perhaps grouped queries. So within a certain table, I might have a number of records that, say, refer to the same customer. And sometimes we want to write a query to say, show me the summary of orders that this one customer has put in. Now, if I do a simple query, then it will just give me a list of all of them with lots of duplication of fields, but some of the fields don't duplicate, but others do. So what an aggregate query allows me to do is actually group up that thing, so kind of summarize all of the records that fall under certain criteria, such as a single customer. So let's jump in and take a look at what I'm talking about here. I have a simple query here that's getting all of the data from the invoice table. I'd like you to make particular note of the customer ID field, because that's one of the things that we're going to be using to illustrate this point. So in order to make this even more clear, let's add an order by clause here, where we're going to sort by customer ID. Now, in the context of the invoice table, the customer ID is the foreign key field back to the customer. And in practical terms, what that tells me is any one particular invoice, what is the primary key value of the customer in the customer table that placed this order. So if I run this, we can see the beginnings of some duplication in our data here. So this is saying customer ID number 1, whomever that is, has actually placed 7 different orders. So they've created 7 different invoices over, the time span of a few years. We can see that there's lots of duplication of a lot of these fields here. Some things are different. You can see, for example, the totals, and back over here, the invoice dates are different. But a lot of the things are duplicate values here. Now, in the previous video where we were discussing the distinct keyword, we saw that if I included in my select list only fields that contained the duplicate values and then used distinct, the behavior we saw was it would remove the duplicates of any records that had the repeating values in the same field. So a grouping query does something very similar, but it gives us a little bit more power to control what's going on. So let's actually change our select list a little bit just to get some of the data we actually want. I'm going to pick my customer ID field. I'm going to add my billing address field. And I'm also going to add my total field. When I run this, you can see I now see a bunch of duplicate data, some differences, but the important thing again is we're seeing the foreign key here to see that this one customer placed all 7 of these orders. So in this example, the overall query that we're going to move towards to illustrate the group by clause is a summary of how much money each customer has spent on things from my store. as it shows up on the invoices. Now, you could make the argument that right now what I'm seeing on screen tells me that. If I could know who customer 1 or customer 2 is, here are the values that they've spent. So I mean, I could take the time and manually add these up and say, okay, 1386 plus 891, etc., etc. But there's an easier way to do that, and that's where my grouping starts coming in. Now, just to show the first point here, I'm actually going to remove the total field for just a second and rerun my query. We can see I'm seeing each customer and what billing address they put in, and we can see these are pretty much all duplicates because most people, they live at the same place, and that would be the same address that they use. Now, I could get away with putting in the distinct keyword here, which would then remove all the duplicates. You can see now I only have one per customer, as long as there were duplicates in there. But there's another way to get the same type of duplicate removal by using a new clause. Now, the new clause is something called group by, and essentially what it is doing is it is saying use the behavior of removing duplicates for all of the columns that are in my select list. Now, that's an important point to realize, that every single column that I indicate in my select list, it has to know how it needs to be grouped. We'll see a little bit more about that in a minute. So let's go ahead here and put in our group by clause. Now, the group by clause always comes after the where clause. So if I had a where clause here, this is where it would go. I'm just going to not have a where clause for simplicity's sake, so let's just assume this was here. The group by clause would go after this, but we're going to remove this for now. So one of the key things you need to realize about the group by clause is, as I indicated a minute ago, you need to tell every field explicitly how it is going to group. Now, the default behavior is to say any column that is listed in this group by clause, it will just find any duplicates that meet that duplicates for that column, and it will remove them, provided that it follows a certain set of rules, which we're getting into. The key here is that every field in your select list must be accounted for by some form of aggregation. So group by says basically just collapse it down to a single record as long as there's duplicates. There's other ways we can do that, which we're going to see a little bit later in the video, but for now I'm going to say we want to group this by customer ID, and since there's also the billing address in my select list, I also need to add that in here. Now, the reason is because this basically tells each of these columns how you are going to summarize yourself. So I'm going to run this, and what we actually see in our results looks identical at this point to what we had said when we just used the distinct keyword. And as I said, these are basically exact to this point. If all you're doing is just using group by to essentially collapse it up into a single record. Now, where this becomes very powerful is if I wanted to actually add in another field here. So I now have 3 fields in my select list. I have only 2 in my group by clause, just to show you if I run this, you will see this particular error message often where it says not a group by expression. That basically means you are not meeting the rules about how to do a group by clause, and most frequently that means you're not telling every column what it has to do. So the temporary problem that we're facing right now is we're saying remove duplicates from customer ID and billing address because they're put in as fields here in the group by clause. But the total field, how do we handle that? Now, we saw earlier that this contains a bunch of essentially currency data in it with a bunch of different values. Now, when you want to summarize or group a numeric value, we have a number of options. So one of those options, if I was just doing simple math, is to just get the sum of all of the values that meet this criteria. So with that in mind, there are a number of things called aggregate functions. What you're seeing on screen here now is just a list of some common aggregate functions. what this does is these are different ways that we can tell a particular field in a grouping query how we want it to kind of behave when we are grouping by a particular field. And we would just put the name of the field inside the parentheses here. Now I'll direct your attention to the one at the bottom here, which is called sum. So what we want to do is, for any duplicate records in the query we were just looking at, we want to only see a single customer ID record with the single billing address record, but we want to see all of the values. There were 7 records, as you recall, with different numbers for the total. We want to actually get the sum of that so that we have a summary per customer. So here's how that would work. We're handling the first 2 fields in our select list by including them in the group by clause, but we don't need to do that in the group by clause itself for the total. In the select list, we use what is known as the aggregate function sum. So I put that around my total. Now what I'm going to get is, when I run this, you can see I now have customer ID 1 and their billing address, and I now have the sum total of all of the total fields, all 7 of the records that met these other 2 criteria, and this is the sum of all of them. And you can see, because I have no where clause, this is actually going in and it is getting the sum for every single individual customer that is in the invoice table. So as I just showed you a minute ago, there are a number of different aggregate functions. So understanding what each is and how we can actually use it and what results they give us is very important. For example, if I wanted to say, instead of getting the total for all orders for a particular customer, if I wanted to say something like, give me the highest order total that each customer has given before, I could use a built-in function, an aggregate function called max. That is still a grouping function, because what it will do is go into the 7 records that we saw for customer ID 1, and it will find what is the top one out of those, the highest value, and it will find it and put it there as the single value in the kind of the collapsed record that's here. Conversely, if I wanted to find what's the lowest, I would use the min aggregate function. If I wanted to find the average for all, per customer, what's the average amount they've spent on any invoice, I could run this, and you can see this is the average, but of course this is looking very bad with all the decimal places. We'd probably want to add the round function in here too, just to make it look a little bit cleaner, but this is giving me the average value. One more thing I'd like to point out here is that the purpose of having the actual group by clause in here, this indicates that it is an aggregate query, but we don't always need it. Its purpose is to tell any fields that have, say, string data or something like that in them, how we want them to behave. And that basically means remove any duplicates, so we just have a single record with this data in it. As an example, if I wanted to say, give me the sum of the total field and have that as the only thing in my select list, I could actually remove my group by clause, because there's only one field in my select list and I'm telling it the grouping behavior that I want to use is the summing. So if I run this, you can see this actually gives me a single value, and this is the sum of every single total value for every single record in the table. Another very handy aggregate function that you will often use is called count. Now the difference between sum and count is sum gives, takes all the values for the group of records and sums them using addition. Count actually gives me the actual count of the numbers that are in there. So we saw before that for customer ID 1 they had 7 records and the total was whatever value it was. The count would be 7. So if I run this here, you can see this is actually the count of every record in the table. So this is very handy to say, if you just want to know how many records are in your table, saying select count of star from whatever table will instantly tell you how many records are in the table, which is a very handy thing to know at times. So in summary, grouping queries or aggregate queries are a very powerful tool in our arsenal as a developer writing SQL statements. The most important thing that I would say that trips the most beginners up is you need to tell every single field in your select list how it is going to be collapsed. So whether it's in using an aggregate function or putting it into the actual group by clause, but every single field must be accounted for.